Hey, I'm gonna bring back about 10 colleagues for an after party, so get things ready, okay? Just because you're in your final month of pregnancy doesn't mean you can't do that much, right? And make sure there are some desserts that the ladies will enjoy. Exhausted from taking care of 2-year-old twins and being in my final month of pregnancy, my body was at its limit. My husband, indifferent to childcare and firmly believing that it was a woman's job, lost his temper when I understandably refused due to the short notice. Reluctantly preparing, I lay down in the nursery to put the twins to sleep. 5 hours later, one of the drunk colleagues stumbled into the nursery and was shocked. "I didn't know you had young kids and a pregnant wife? Did you trick us?" He raised his fist towards my husband. Then, with one remark from my husband, the enjoyable after-party turned into chaos. I married my husband at 28. It was a whirlwind romance, and we married within a few months. Unable to quit my job immediately, we agreed I'd hand over my duties and resign upon becoming pregnant. My husband always wanted me to be a homemaker. However, we didn't actively try for kids, and for the first year, we enjoyed a typical newlywed life. I became pregnant just before turning 30, and true to our agreement, I left my job to become a full-time homemaker. Upon learning of the twins, my husband was excited about becoming a father of 2. He eagerly told everyone about our growing family. Due to the twins and it being my first pregnancy, I was advised to have a managed hospital stay. My husband agreed, fearing it might be too late if something went wrong. However, I was worried about the household during my stay, as my husband was nearly incapable of housework. This concern was alleviated by my in-laws' suggestion. The options were for my mother-in-law to regularly check on my husband or for him to stay at his parents' until my return. He chose the latter. Eventually, I safely delivered the twins via C-section. My discharge was a grand affair, attended by my husband, in-laws, and parents. Nurses commented on how happy our family seemed. Yet, upon returning home, my husband's attitude changed. "Good to be back in my own house. Enough of my mom's nagging. Tea, please." I was taken aback. Expecting our parents to stay, they instead suggested we have some family time alone. My in-laws went back, and my parents returned to their hotel. My husband, complaining of a sore shoulder, left me with the babies and the luggage. Thankfully, he held one twin briefly, but soon placed them on a sofa, demanding tea. "Set up the baby's sleeping area first." In pain, I arranged a place for the twins to sleep. This was just the beginning of my husband's disinterest in parenting. The next day, my parents arrived early. "Kids first, then everything else, right?" my mom said, speaking from experience. Indeed, I was prioritizing the twins and my husband, leaving my own needs last. My in-laws arrived around noon. Having already seen my mother's efforts and realizing the extent of twin care, from then on, parenting became a joint effort with both sets of grandparents. My father-in-law and father were still working, so my mother-in-law and mother couldn't always prioritize the twins. With my parents living out of state, it was clear we'd rely heavily on my in-laws. They adored the twins, never faulted my inexperience, and reassured me to take things slowly. "It's a time to learn what being a mother means from our children, so there's no need to regret what you can't do," they said, which was very reassuring. Having my mother come over for the weekends from out of state and my mother-in-law helping during weekdays was incredibly motivating. Men might find it hard to get involved in childcare, but it can be enjoyable once they take the first step, as told by my father-in-law when he got involved in childcare. This was based on his own experience, acknowledging the initial embarrassment or fear of failure. My own father shared how nervous he was when he first took me out. However, despite hearing these stories, my husband showed no interest, responding with just "huh" or "really." Moreover, his attitude worsened in the absence of my parents, leading to my in-laws losing their patience. He complained about being hungry and demanded a proper meal while I was breastfeeding the twins, criticizing the use of ready meals and insisting on a home-cooked meal as it's a homemaker's duty. "It's not like I'm using ready meals all the time," as my husband claims, but it seems he's dissatisfied even if just one item is a ready meal. He seemed to view the use of ready meals as slacking off in housework. "You're not a child. If you're hungry, make something yourself. Babies can't feed themselves. Why don't you suggest taking turns breastfeeding with formula milk instead of demanding a cooked meal?" My husband was initially shocked when scolded by my in-laws. If I cook, there'll be nothing left for a full-time homemaker to do, and if I breastfeed, what's left for a mother to do? My in-laws and I were astounded by his response. What followed was a barrage of lectures from my mother-in-law and basic childcare lessons from my father-in-law. My husband reluctantly helped but remained sullen throughout. For the next 2 years, until I became pregnant with our third child, he used work as an excuse to avoid childcare in front of my parents. With my in-laws, excuses didn't work, so he participated in childcare, albeit grudgingly. During my second pregnancy, I again suffered from severe morning sickness. Even my husband, seeing my obvious discomfort, couldn't demand anything and started doing more household chores and childcare. This was partly thanks to my in-laws' initial guidance. However, he gradually began finding excuses not to do them. The turning point was when he cooked a meal that wasn't very tasty. Mistakes happen, and I appreciated his effort and tried to eat as much as I could. But couldn't finish it due to feeling unwell. He took this as a silent accusation of his cooking being inedible. Feeling that his efforts were futile, he started to think it was a waste of his time. Once he began cutting corners, his dedication quickly faded, and it didn't even last a month. Now, he spends his weekends enjoying his hobbies and often comes home late on weekdays, citing work or social engagements. There were days when we barely saw each other. Still, I asked him to come home earlier or to spend at least one weekend day at home. I didn't need him to take care of me, just to spend time with the twins. You've been parenting for 2 years now, so you're probably used to it, right? Plus, it's your second time giving birth, and this time it's just one baby. There's nothing left for me to do. With that, my husband left to enjoy his hobbies. Lately, the 2-year-old twins had become more sensitive to our attitudes. They seemed to sense something was amiss from my husband's tone and my facial expressions. Unconsciously, I let out sighs of disappointment. Why did I get pregnant with a third child in such a situation? I couldn't help but question myself relentlessly. It's true that occasionally my husband showed a kind side to me, despite his lack of cooperation in childcare. When he sought physical intimacy, I felt reassured that he hadn't lost interest in me, but I also complied because refusing would upset him and create problems for me. Looking back, I realized this was a vicious cycle that led to our current situation. It's not that I dislike the baby in my belly. In fact, I'm happy about the pregnancy. But somewhere in my heart, I felt like this wasn't the right time. Yet, feeling the baby move inside my growing belly was endearing. I would stroke my belly and apologize for being a weak mom, promising to become stronger and asking the baby to be born healthy. Soon, it was decided that this birth would also be via C-section. I had to be admitted to the hospital in line with the due date, and there were preparations to be made. Most importantly, I needed my husband's help to take care of the twins while I was hospitalized. I couldn't ask him to take time off work, but I hoped he could at least help in the evenings. However, he said he couldn't make such a commitment as work was unpredictable. The idea of a man taking time off to align with his wife's childbirth is embarrassing. It makes me look like a henpecked husband. His words left me speechless. I thought of retorting, but before I could say anything, he cut me off with a demand for dinner. Let's not revisit that topic. The twins are 2 now, they can eat when they're hungry. Really? Then a 30-something man should be more capable of feeding himself than a 2-year-old. Why don't you show the kids how it's done? I'm fine. It's my earnings that keep this family going. You should be making me a grateful dinner as a sign of appreciation. His logic was infuriating. As my pregnancy progressed, the strain on my back increased, slowing down my movements. He criticized my housework as being slow or lacking enthusiasm. His favorite phrase lately was, "I'm the one providing for this family." He was the one who insisted on me being a homemaker once I got pregnant, despite my preference for working. Of course, I agreed to his insistence, but the idea of him providing for us was hard to accept. As I approached the 36th week of pregnancy, my movements became even slower, and his words grew harsher. His complete lack of consideration infuriated me, but fearing harm to my body, I refrained from arguing back. I kept my urge to argue in check and absorbed the unkind words from my husband. And then, the 38th week of my pregnancy, scheduled for a C-section, was quickly approaching. Rethink the C-section. The last time was twins, so it was unavoidable, but this time it's just one, right? Wouldn't you feel more fulfillment giving birth naturally? My husband didn't understand anything. Giving birth is risking one's life. His opinions and preferences are irrelevant. So, a C-section means early hospitalization and a longer stay. Basically, you're choosing a C-section because you want to avoid housework, right? I couldn't comprehend how he concluded that choosing a C-section equates to wanting to avoid housework. Nevertheless, I patiently explained the risks to both mother and baby. If my explanation wasn't clear, I suggested he could hear it from the doctor. But he wouldn't listen at all. You're bad at explaining. Why should I, of all people, take time out of my schedule to hear about C-sections? It's not me who's giving birth. I'm explaining why a C-section was chosen because you labeled it as a way to avoid housework. Yet, he dismisses it as irrelevant and ends the conversation. On the day of my admission, I tried to get his understanding to avoid being obstructed. But he snapped at me, calling me persistent. Amidst this, my husband unexpectedly called. He said he's bringing 10 colleagues home for an after-party and asked me to prepare food, including desserts that women would enjoy. Before we had kids, my husband used to bring colleagues over to our house for drinks. Back then, it was enjoyable to share good times with them, even though they were his colleagues. After I got pregnant, the frequency of these gatherings gradually decreased. Especially after the twins were born, it never happened. According to my husband, he invites them, but they hesitate because of the twins. It seems that my husband's colleagues were hesitant about having a gathering at a house with young twins. In essence, they were being considerate. The twins are still 2 years old and need constant attention. I couldn't understand why these considerate colleagues would suddenly decide to come over in a group of 10. I'm about to be hospitalized, and labor could start any time. Preparing a meal for guests in such a condition is impossible. I told my husband that it's unreasonable to expect me to do so, especially at this time, without prior notice. I suggested, even if it goes a bit over budget, to have the after-party at a different place. He's often generous with his colleagues and juniors, though it could be seen as showing off. There was even a time he spent a few $1,000s in one day on drinks. I pleaded with him, very humbly, to not bring them home this time, even if it costs that much. But my husband snapped back in anger. You said we were going to do it at my house. Are you trying to embarrass me? My husband insisted, saying things like a wife should support her husband's image, and that a wife should just be quiet and follow her husband. He was adamant about taking me along and having me prepare everything. I didn't have the energy to argue anymore and felt it would be easier to just do as told. It was impossible to go shopping at this hour, so I warned him that I could only make do with what we had and prepared a meal for 10 people. I was glad I had bought extra ingredients, anticipating a situation like this. However, I'd use them all up tonight and would have to shop again tomorrow. I wonder if I'll be able to go. While cooking, I felt my belly getting tense. My husband had also told me to hide in the room with the twins and keep quiet once everything was ready. So, I did just that. When I started putting the twins to bed, my husband returned home with 10 colleagues. Their noise woke the twins, but I quietly asked them to stay quiet and put them back to sleep. Watching the twins sleep, I felt relieved, but then the pain in my belly started to worry me. I almost let out a cry, but covered my mouth with both hands and stayed hidden. The pain got worse and more distinct. This might be a serious situation. Just then, the door suddenly opened. Sorry, I mistook this for the bathroom, huh? Apparently, a colleague, drunk, had opened the door by mistake. But in the room were the sleeping twins and me, a pregnant woman, barely holding back a groan of pain. I brushed it off, telling him to enjoy himself without worrying about me, as I knew him from previous visits. Don't worry about us? He stuttered, leaving the room with me and the twins. From the living room, I heard his angry voice. Hey, what are you doing, leaving your little kids and wife alone? And isn't your wife pregnant? With that belly, she must be due soon, right? Huh? What does that mean? I thought they were aware of the situation to some extent when they came. I had assumed they were being considerate until now, so why this sudden change? I thought maybe they were joking around after a few drinks, and my husband took it seriously. I believed it had reached this point because, once my husband had agreed to it, he couldn't back down and, prioritizing appearances, he went as far as getting angry to demand that I comply. But from the colleagues' conversation, it didn't seem that way. He had been declining invitations to a house with small kids. So, my husband kept inviting him, disregarding the refusals. The colleague felt guilty for coming so late at night to a house with kids and a pregnant woman. Why did this happen? Regarding this, a colleague said, I was told you and the kids were at your parents' house, and that your husband was alone, so no need to worry. Believing that, 10 colleagues came to our house for an after-party. I told you to hide so you wouldn't be seen. Well, if you were seen, it can't be helped. She always uses excuses like taking care of the twins or being pregnant and close to delivery to skip household chores. I had to make her cook, at least. Making a meal for 10 people at once, considering how much she has been slacking, it's still not enough. My husband said this with a voice full of confidence, as if he believed what he was doing was right. Cooking too? And for 10 people, at this hour? An unusual voice echoed, and curious, I left the room. I was worried about what my enraged husband might do. There are people who act like tyrants at home but pretend to be reasonable in public. I couldn't say for sure if my husband was that type, but knowing him at home, I had no idea what he might do now. Peeking into the living room, I saw a colleague grabbing my husband by the shirt. Even the drunken colleagues were trying to calm him down, saying he was going too far. However, the angry colleague explained why he couldn't calm down, and those who were defending my husband started looking at him suspiciously. Several colleagues, who also had children the same age as the twins, expressed their disbelief and scorn towards my husband. Female colleagues said from my perspective, it was unforgivable, calling him the worst kind of husband. Voices suggested disbanding the gathering, and some colleagues started to tidy up. When my husband was called the worst as both a husband and a father, he shrank from his previously arrogant demeanor and was unable to retort. Several colleagues noticed me and apologized. Moving to a nearby sofa to ease my body, I realized that the pain in my stomach was coming at regular intervals. Certain it was labor, I sought help from my husband, who was being scolded and shrinking away. But he didn't respond. A colleague noticed and asked if I needed to call the hospital. When I nodded, they handed me the cordless phone. I managed to call the hospital, which told me to come right away. I had my hospital bag ready in the bedroom. Attempting to get up to fetch it, a female colleague offered to get it if I permitted her into the room, and I agreed. Honestly, I felt like labor at this hour? My husband was useless, his spirit broken, and I wondered if it was right to call my in-laws at this time to ask them to take care of the twins. How many times had I wished we lived near my parents? I could have asked my own parents without any hesitation. If you're going to go, go by yourself. And if you call an ambulance, tell them not to use the siren, okay? It'd be embarrassing if the neighbors found out, right? It's your fault things turned sour, so take responsibility for it. The reason things turned sour was because my husband's lies were exposed. I was doing exactly as my worthless husband said, staying quietly locked in the room. After all, lies are bound to be uncovered. Especially men's lies, which are often poorly crafted. Blaming me for his own self-inflicted problems? I wanted to lash out in anger, but I felt like my body couldn't handle the stress of it. As I was suppressing my urge to speak out, I heard the sound of something being struck. Looking towards the noise, I saw one of my husband's colleagues, someone I also knew, slapping my husband across the face. I never thought you were such a rotten person. Giving birth is a matter of life and death. You hit me? I've never even been hit by my parents. Huh? Where have I heard such a line before? I was astounded that someone would actually say something like that in real life. And, maybe due to a deeply wounded pride or embarrassment, his face turned beet red. His ears were red too, and he seemed to feel deeply humiliated. Sorry for asking too much of someone who doesn't know pain to show empathy. Listen, the pain your wife is experiencing is far beyond this. Why am I the only one being blamed? I'm not in the wrong. After all, I'm the one supporting them. My husband argued that I was the one at fault for behaving in a way that embarrassed him in public, and that he was not to blame at all. He even shouted at the colleague who slapped him, threatening to sue for assault. However, none of the colleagues were listening to him anymore. They told him to go ahead and sue if he wanted, and asked me what I needed. With all the commotion, the twins woke up. They were scared, seeing all the unknown adults and hearing the raised voices, and started crying. I was overwhelmed taking care of myself, and now I had to calm the twins too, which honestly frustrated me. In such a time, a useless husband who prioritizes his pride is unnecessary. Just as I was thinking of calling my in-laws for help, a female colleague and a colleague with children offered to take care of the twins. Gratefully, I accepted their offer. The woman said she often took care of her nieces and nephews, and the man said his kids were about the same age as the twins. I informed them that the twins' room had plenty of toys, there were no allergies to worry about for meals, and they could use any food in the house. I also mentioned that my mother-in-law was supposed to come in the morning, but I would contact her to come earlier. Some colleagues who had experienced childbirth suggested it would be faster to take a taxi. They tried to call one, but it was going to take a while. Then one colleague mentioned he had a subordinate living nearby who wasn't at the gathering. The subordinate, also a father of a young child, rushed over after being called. His wife, understanding the situation, had urged him to leave quickly. I think it was a made-up story, but it was a thoughtful gesture that I appreciated. My husband kept insisting on his righteousness, but the colleague and I completely ignored him. The colleague's subordinate drove me to the hospital, and the female colleague who came with me said she would stay until my in-laws or parents arrived. I expressed my gratitude as she even contacted my parents and in-laws on my behalf. Despite having work the next day, she insisted it was fine and stayed with me until my in-laws arrived. My parents, living out of state, arrived the next morning. They didn't make it for the cesarean delivery, but were relieved to hear that both mother and child were safe. The real turmoil started once everything settled down. First, when my in-laws and my parents learned that the woman who called them was my husband's colleague, they suspected infidelity. They were curious about the circumstances under which the alleged mistress had contacted them, but decided to rush to the hospital first. Upon arriving and hearing the full story, they were shocked to realize the situation was far more serious than an affair. At the hospital, noticing the absence of my husband, my in-laws assumed he was at home taking care of the twins. They felt somewhat relieved thinking that, although he failed as a husband, he was fulfilling his duties as a father. However, the reality was that my colleagues were taking care of the twins, and I had been forced to cook for 10 people while nearing childbirth. My in-laws apologized to me and my parents for my husband's misbehavior. My in-laws suggested that it would be better for me if my parents were here, and quickly left to deal with my husband. The scene they encountered at our home was apparently appalling. By the time they arrived, all of my husband's colleagues, except the 2 who had offered to look after the twins, had gone home. While the remaining colleagues were busy taking care of the twins and cleaning up after the gathering, my husband was sulking in a corner, drinking beer from a can. My mother-in-law handed over some taxi fare and a small token of thanks to the remaining 2 colleagues and said she wanted to apologize and thank them properly for this incident. She didn't think money could solve it. It's just that, at that moment, the only way she could show her gratitude and apology was that. Later on, my in-laws went and thanked 10 of my husband's colleagues. When it was just my husband, his parents, and the twins, my mother-in-law took the twins out for a walk. She probably didn't want to show the kids their father getting scolded. When they returned home after a while, my husband's cheek was even more swollen, so it seems he got a solid hit from his father. My husband, thoroughly lectured by his father, looked like he had lost his soul. Even after all that, he insisted that what he did wasn't wrong. During my return home with our 3rd child, my husband never once had a change of heart. In front of his parents, he seemed to do what he was told. Getting hit by his father seemed to have a big impact on him, but as soon as his parents left, he reverted back to his old self. With 2-year-old twins and a newborn baby, I couldn't free up my hands, yet he was ordering me around. He started saying it was my fault for being an inadequate wife, which was why his father hit him. He was just too much to handle. I decided to divorce him and told my in-laws and my parents about it. My parents were totally in favor. Actually, before I was discharged from the hospital, they had told me to return to my parents' house. My in-laws, disappointed in their son, said they had no reason to oppose and apologized for the trouble he caused. My husband was the only one strongly against the divorce and didn't agree immediately. He consulted his colleagues at work, saying I was pushing for a divorce. But the colleagues were surprised I hadn't asked for a divorce earlier and supported my decision. In essence, my husband was abandoned by his colleagues. Rumors started at his workplace about some incident happening during a home party he hosted. The source is unclear, but the day after the party, a few, including my husband, were absent or late to work. Moreover, my in-laws even went to the company to meet the residents who were there at the time and apologize. From this, it seems my husband did something to his colleagues. Seeing both of my husband's parents apologizing together, what on earth did he do? Speculation began in the office. Meanwhile, news of my safe delivery spread among the 10 colleagues who attended the party. Curious employees speculated that maybe my delivery caused my husband to mess up. The rumor, not entirely inaccurate, spread, and my husband was looked down upon not only by colleagues but also by subordinates. Eventually, his work failures became prominent, and feeling uncomfortable, he voluntarily left the job. Only then did he seem to realize the gravity of his actions. Initially, he agreed to the divorce in a fit of anger, but after quitting his job and returning to his parents' house, he couldn't find peace. He begged me, almost in tears, to reconsider, saying the home we had was his sanctuary. But by then, I had already let go of that house. I returned to my parents' house and am raising our children with their help. I have no time to spare for a man I've already given up on. Afterward, my husband couldn't find a job before the deadline and was kicked out of his parents' house. With no money and forced out, he was driven into a corner, unable to be choosy about jobs with the looming child support and alimony payments due to me. He resorted to borrowing money from dangerous sources just to make ends meet, which led him into a life of being chased by debt collectors. Now, he's stuck in a tough job run by shady lenders, barely making enough money each day, which is almost immediately taken away for debt repayment. I went back to my parents' house, but I still keep in touch with my ex-husband's colleagues and his parents. The twins wanted to see the big sister and big brother who played with them back then, so I reached out, not expecting much, and that's how we reconnected. At that time, I thought, what kind of colleagues come to a party at such a time? But it turned out, aside from my husband, they were all very sensible people. I believe I owe my current happiness to those 10 people. I've even started socializing with some of them who have families, on a family-to-family basis. It's a strong relationship where we share our parenting woes. My in-laws were very good to me, and the twins were fond of them. Since my parents also had a good relationship with my in-laws, they regularly come to visit the twins and the new baby. This whole experience made me realize that life is about helping each other out. I won't forget the gratitude I felt then, and I plan to become even happier than I am now. With my precious family.